I heard one hollow note beneath the dust, and knew this room remembered me.
She was 19 and homeless. No room, no desk, no family key, just one cracked goose quill and $4 she had earned trimming labels in a stationery shop. And with that $4, she bought a forgotten feather quill cutting room outside Concord, Middlesex County, Massachusetts, missing from town maps since 1937. The west roof had folded inward. 3 front windows were sealed with boards. The county condemned it on March 18, 2022, with demolition planned for the first dry week of autumn. But inside a hollow cutting block, a nibby gauge had kept watch over an unopened chamber for 85 years, holding papers that would alter the shape of her life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Elsie Crowe had been learning to leave her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she learned which floorboards complained after midnight, how to close a cupboard without waking anyone, and how to keep precious things in plain brown envelopes. Her father, Thomas, made little repairs for a historical society near Concord, and their rented kitchen often smelled of tea dust and feathers warming beside the stove. I was a narrow-shouldered man with patient hands and a habit of testing every blade against his thumbnail. When Elsie was 8, he showed her that a quill was not merely sharpened. It was cured, hardened, opened, balanced, and persuaded to carry a human hand without fighting it. On Saturdays, they took the early bus to the society's workroom where Mr. Abel Wren, her father's oldest friend, kept a bench beneath a north window. Abel had white eyebrows like 2 brushstrokes and wore a leather apron darkened by 40 years of oil. He taught Elsie to sort goose feathers by curve to warm the barrels in sand and to make the first slicing cut away from the body. At noon, he unwrapped rye bread and an apple, divided both into 3 exact portions, and set the smallest knife beside her plate. After eating, they practiced on ruined quills until the slit opened straight and the shoulders flexed evenly. The ritual never changed: sweep the bench oil, the knife count, the sound strokes on scrap paper, then place the besta nib in a cedar box. A careless cut makes the hand apologize, Abel once told her. He meant that poor work traveled onward into another person's fingers and made them struggle for a mistake they had not made. Abel died during a sleet storm when Elsie was 15. The society closed his room before spring in the cedar box. The small brass gauge and 3 of her father's knives disappeared into storage. 2 years later, Thomas died of pneumonia. His writing desk, promised to Elsie since childhood, remained in the front room beneath a sheet. Claire Crowe became quieter after the funeral, but not kinder. She moved through the house with keys tied to a blue ribbon at her waist and kept every bill beneath a china weight. She asked where Elsie had been, what she had spent, how long a lamp had burned. Nothing was shouted. Doors simply began closing earlier. The kettle stopped being left warm for her. Her father's photographs vanished from the mantel one by one, and Claire called the empty spaces tidier. On October 3, Elsie returned from the stationery shop carrying a paper sack of heel bread. Her key entered the lock but would not turn. Through the parlor window, she saw the pale rectangle where the writing desk had stood. Claire opened the door only 6 inches. Behind her, Elsie's mother's old wool shawl hung over a chair, untouched, as if silence itself had chosen a side. "The desk is sold. You cannot stay here." Exactly 8 words delivered without anger. Claire placed Elsie's cracked quill on the threshold, then a biscuit tin containing 2 stockings, a comb, and 4 folded dollars. She closed the door slowly enough that Elsie watched the brass latch cross the gap. The paper sack split when she bent to lift it. Bread rolled into the wet gutter, and she gathered every piece because leaving it there felt like waste. For 6 weeks, she moved according to weather and closing hours. In Cambridge, she slept 2 nights behind a church boiler vent where warm brick dried one sleeve while the other remained cold. In Somerville, she paid 75 cents for coffee and sat upright until the diner closed, then rested beneath a stairwell that smelled of iron rain. She walked to Medford, slept in a laundromat until the attendant touched her shoe with a broom, and spent another $1 on bread soap and a bus ride she regretted before the doors had shut. Her money fell from $4 to $2.10, then to 85 cents. She kept the cracked quill wrapped in a handkerchief, not because it could write, but because her father's thumb had once rested against the same split barrel. By the 6th week, November had hardened the ground. Elsie entered the Concord Free Public Library to warm her hands over a radiator and found the classified pages left beside a chair. A small notice had been boxed in blue pencil: county disposal structure and lot old quill cutting room, $4 taxes assumed, inquire Middlesex clerk. Someone had written unsafe across the margin. Beneath it, in fainter pencil, another hand had added Wren place. She read those 2 words 3 times. Then she carried the paper to the reference desk and asked for a road map. The librarian, a woman with a silver chain on her glasses, traced the route without asking why Elsie's coat was damp. At dawn the next morning, Elsie spent her final 85 cents on the first bus west, keeping the 4 purchase dollars hidden inside her shoe. By nightfall, she would be walking toward a building that remembered her name. The bus left Elsie beside a gasoline pump 12 miles east of Concord, where the driver pointed along the road and told her the next service would not come until morning. She walked 7 miles before dusk, her shoes taking in water along the seams. Beyond Lincoln, rain became sleet, and she found an open hay barn set back behind a stone wall. The loft smelled of dry grass mouse nests in old summer. She buried her legs beneath loose hay and woke whenever the wind lifted a roof panel. At 3 in the morning, the thermometer nailed beside the door showed 27 degrees. By daylight, her stockings had stiffened inside her shoes. She walked the remaining 5 miles beneath a sky the color of pewter, passing frozen pasture and bare maples until Concord gathered around the road. The town announced itself in painted glass and hanging signs: McCone's barbershop with a striped pole turning slowly, Anderson's market setting apples beneath an awning, the Concord shoe repair with 3 boots in its window, a narrow cafe called the Mill Table, and Barrett's Hardware, where snow shovels stood in a disciplined row. Elsie did not enter any of them. The $4 in her shoe seemed to grow warmer with every step. The Middlesex clerk's office occupied the ground floor of a brick municipal building off Monument Square. Inside, steam pipes clicked behind painted walls. A ceiling fan turned without purpose, moving the smell of wool coats, carbon paper, and floor wax from one side of the room to the other. The woman behind the property counter had a copper-colored birthmark along her left jaw and half-moon spectacles held by a black cord. Her brass nameplate read Margaret Bell, Deputy Clerk. Elsie placed the folded, classified notice on the counter. "I came about the Quill room." Margaret Bell read the notice, then studied Elsie's wet coat and the mud drying white around her hems. She pulled a ledger from beneath the counter, opened it to a page marked by blue ribbon, and turned the book so Elsie could see the parcel number. "You understand the building is condemned?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no water service, no electricity, and no county repair assistance?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the taxes become yours when this deed is stamped?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county may order demolition if the structure is not made safe before September?" "Yes, ma'am." The clerk removed her spectacles and cleaned them with a square of linen. "Most buyers ask whether the land can be cleared." "I do not want it cleared." "No," Margaret said, looking at the cracked quill tucked inside Elsie's coat. "I suppose you do not." She prepared the deed on thick paper with a red margin, entering the consideration as $4 and the property as one structure with 2 3/10 acres. Elsie removed her right shoe beneath the counter and took out 4 folded bills wrapped in waxed paper. She flattened each one with her palm. Margaret accepted them without comment. Elsie signed Elsie Thomas Crowe in a space no wider than her thumb. The clerk stopped before lowering the stamp. "Thomas Crowe, my father." Margaret looked again at the signature. "Abel Wren used to come in here every January to pay this parcel's tax. He spoke of a Thomas Crowe who could cut a writing NIB thin enough for copperplate without weakening the shoulder." Elsie kept one hand on the counter. "My father studied with him." The office sounds seemed to retreat, the fan belt, a telephone ringing in another room, the scratch of a pen at a distant desk. Margaret turned toward a cabinet and searched through a bundle of index cards. She found one bearing the property number and Abel Wren's narrow handwriting. "He never owned the place," she said. "He paid the arrears for whoever did. The last payment was made 6 weeks before he died. He wrote your father's name under emergency contact, though there was no address." Elsie touched the edge of the card but did not lift it. "Why would he do that?" "I could not tell you." Margaret returned her spectacles to her face. "But I remember him saying the room was not abandoned. He said it had merely lost the person meant to open it." The brass deed press stood on a separate oak table. Margaret placed the paper beneath its round plate and drew the long handle down with both hands. The machine closed with a deliberate iron sound. When she lifted it, the county seal had risen from the page in sharp circles. She passed Elsie the deed, a tax notice, and directions written on the back of an envelope. "Take Lexington Road northeast for 1 8/10 miles. Turn left at Old Bedford Road. After the stone culvert, follow the unpaved lane beside the marsh for 900 yards. The building is beyond 2 walnut trees. Do not cross the plank bridge. It no longer carries weight." At the door, Margaret called her back and placed one of the $4 bills inside the center drawer of her desk. "The county requires payment," she said. "It does not require me to deposit it today." Elsie did not understand, but the clerk had already closed the drawer. The afternoon had cleared when she began walking. Lexington Road held a gray ribbon of slush between old houses and winter fields. A mile beyond town, an elderly man in a canvas coat stood beside a mailbox while a red hound watched her from behind his knees. "You headed to the Wren room?" he asked. Elsie nodded. The dog lifted its nose toward her coat, catching the feather scent. "Lane floods in spring," the man said. "Name's Silas Reed, house with the green shutters. Shout if the well rope breaks." He touched 2 fingers to his cap and went inside. The hound remained until Elsie passed from sight. Old Bedford Road narrowed beside the marsh. Ice held along the reeds and dark water moved beneath it with a sound like paper being slowly torn. At the stone culvert, she found the lane Margaret had described, half concealed by sumac. 900 yards later, 2 walnut trees rose from opposite sides of the path, their branches crossing above her like black ribs. The cutting room stood beyond them. It was a timber-framed cottage roughly 24 feet long and 16 feet wide, set on a fieldstone foundation. Weathered clapboards showed traces of ochre paint beneath silver grain. The roof sagged above the western wall where 3 courses of shingles had slipped away. A square brick chimney leaned 2 inches toward the marsh. Over the boarded front window hung a narrow sign, its lettering reduced by rain to feather quill cut. Elsie walked around the building once before touching it. The rear sill had softened near the ground, but the corner posts remained straight. Moss filled the north gutter. Someone had tied the back shutter closed with copper wire. The county key resisted until she leaned her shoulder against the door. It opened with a tearing sound as paint separated from the frame. Cold air came outward carrying cedar dust, damp plaster, and the faint mineral scent of old ink. Her first step disturbed grit that crackled under her shoe. Light entered through knotholes in the boards, forming thin white rods across the front room. A counter ran along one wall, its surface furred with dust. When she drew a fingertip through it, the wood beneath appeared almost black. She heard water moving below the foundation and farther inside the loose tap of a shutter. The room tasted of lime when she breathed through her mouth. Behind a partition stood the cutting chamber. Goose feather cabinets lined the wall, their shallow drawers labeled Swan, Goose, Crow, and Practice in faded ink. A grinding table had split from end to end. On it rested a shallow bowl containing dried sand and 3 pale feather shafts that collapsed when she touched them. Something brushed her cheek. She turned quickly, then saw a strand of horsehair plaster hanging from the ceiling. By evening, the building had surrendered no heat. Elsie carried fallen twigs from beneath the walnut trees, but did not risk the chimney. She ate the heel of bread saved from Cambridge and drank water collected from a clean rim of ice at the well. She spread her coat on the front room floor and placed the deed beneath her shirt. Through the boards over the window, moonlight made 4 narrow lines across the planks. The marsh shifted beyond the wall, and once the red hound barked far down the road. Elsie lay awake, listening until the building's separate noises became distinguishable: roof timber, shutter, latch, water mice. Then beneath them all, she heard one measured wooden click from the cutting room. The room had kept what the world had forgotten. At first light, Elsie followed the sound beneath the floorboards and found only a warped plank settling against an iron nail. For 3 days, the building taught her its smallest rules. The well stood 30 paces behind the cutting room beneath a square cedar cover. Its rope had rotted through near the bucket, so Elsie tied the sound end with a sheet bend and lowered an enamel cup until Silas Reed brought a replacement rope. The water rose cold enough to ache in her teeth with a trace of iron that faded after it stood in a jar. The outhouse leaned toward the sumac and had no door. She rehung it with 2 bent strap hinges found beneath the workbench, then filled the cracks with folded feed sacks. Indoors, she learned that the 4th plank beside the front counter gave a high complaint, while the board near the back partition answered with a lower sound. At night, she could tell whether a mouse crossed the room or the building merely contracted in the cold. On the 4th morning, she walked back into Concord carrying a list written on the reverse of Margaret Bell's envelope. Barrett's hardware was deeper than it appeared from the street. Narrow aisles ran between drawers of screws, coils of rope, stovepipe elbows, and jars containing nails sorted by size. The air held linseed oil iron filings and the dry medicinal scent of powdered lime. The owner emerged from behind a wall of snow shovels. He had one cloudy blue eye and a mustache clipped so squarely that it seemed measured with a ruler. "Barrett," he said. "Owen Barrett." "Elsie Crowe." His clear eye paused on her face. "The Quill place." She unfolded her list. "I need chimney brushes, lamp oil, a bucket, and whatever $4 will not buy." Owen read the list without smiling. $4 will not buy most of this. "I can work." "Doing what?" "I can sharpen knives, mend paper boxes, sweep, carry coal, and cut a goose quill that does not scratch." He picked up the cracked feather tucked through her buttonhole and turned it beneath the hanging lamp. "Not with this one." "No." "Who taught you?" "Thomas Crowe and Abel Wren." Owen set the feather down carefully. He pulled a ruled ledger from beneath the counter and wrote her name at the top of a clean page. "I will open 30 days of credit. You pay something each Saturday, even if it is 10 cents. "I will." "You miss 2 Saturdays, the account closes." "I understand." He added a thin, water-stained booklet titled Repairs for the Isolated Household. "This is free," he said. "Free means you return it." She left with a 6-inch wire chimney brush for $1.20, 20 feet of hemp rope for 90 cents, a galvanized bucket for 75 cents, a quart of lamp oil for 40 cents, and a used draw knife for $2.10 entered against her name. Owen also gave her a paper sack of stove matches with no price written beside them. The chimney took most of the next day. Elsie first removed the rusted stovepipe and sealed the opening with a damp cloth. She tied the wire brush to the new rope, climbed onto the eastern slope where the shingles still held, and lowered the brush from the chimney crown. It stopped 6 feet down. She raised it, twisted twice, and drove it again until a hardened collar of creosote broke loose inside the flue. Black fragments struck the hearth for nearly an hour. Some were brittle as burnt sugar. Others came down greasy and sharp-smelling, leaving soot beneath her fingernails, even through the cloth wrapped around her hands. She worked the brush up and down in 12-inch strokes, changing direction whenever it caught, then scraped the smoke shelf with the draw knife's blunt back. After 5 hours, she lowered a weighted rag through the full length of the flue. It reached the hearth without stopping. She inspected the mortar with the lamp held close. 2 joints had opened, but no daylight showed through them. For a test, she burned a twist of newspaper beneath the throat. The smoke rose directly instead of curling into the room. Only then did she make a fire. She laid 3 dry twigs across 2 pieces of split walnut, leaving a thumb's width between them. The first match failed in the draft. The second caught. Flame traveled along the paper, paused beneath the wood, then settled into a small blue-edged burn. The chimney drew cleanly. Elsie sat on the floor with both hands extended toward the hearth until her fingers hurt from returning warmth. She boiled well water in a dented tin cup, softened bread in it, and added half an onion Owen had placed in her bucket. The meal was thin, but steam filled the room, and for the first time since October, she ate with a locked door between herself and the weather. That evening, she began the workroom inventory. She chose only objects that could still answer a hand. A narrow curing tray lined with sand, a horn-handled quill knife dulled but unbroken, 2 bundles of goose feathers tied with green thread, a pumice stone worn hollow at the center, a brass slit saw no longer than a finger, 7 cork pen rests, and a cutting block built from dark cedar. The block stood beneath the north window. Its upper face held shallow grooves of several widths, each polished by repeated use. Along one edge, someone had burned a row of marks into the wood broad-letter copperplate ledger. Elsie lifted it to clear the dust beneath. The block was heavier than cedar should have been. She set it down, pressed her knuckles against each corner, and listened. 3 corners answered with a close, solid sound. The 4th gave back a faint, hollow note. She tried the knife along the bottom seam, but the wood had no visible joint. She turned the block over and found a circular cedar disc fitted into its underside no wider than a silver dollar. Its grain had been aligned so carefully with the surrounding wood that dust was the only thing outlining it. The disc did not move beneath her thumbnail. Elsie warmed the block beside the hearth for 10 minutes, then wrapped the disc with a damp cloth so the fibers around it would swell unevenly. When she tried again, the circle turned less than 1/8 of an inch. She worked slowly, pressing with both thumbs, stopping whenever the wood complained. After 20 minutes, the disc loosened. A narrow brass pin appeared beneath its edge. She pulled the pin with the tip of the slit saw, and something inside the block released with a quiet click. A section of the side slid outward. The hidden space was longer than her hand and lined with thin sheets of tin. Inside lay 3 packages wrapped separately in waxed cloth. She carried them to the front room and washed the soot from her hands before touching the knots. The first bundle contained tools. There were 2 quill knives with blades ground differently, one for opening the barrel and one for shaping the shoulders. A small bone-handled scraper rested between them. Beneath it lay a brass nib gauge divided into 11 narrow openings, each labeled in Abel Wren's handwriting. Elsie placed the cracked quill into the widest slot. It fit badly, leaning against one edge. The second package held raw materials: 12 cured goose feathers, 6 swan feathers yellowed with age, 3 crow shafts meant for fine work, squares of pumice paper, and a packet of clean river sand. Every feather had been wrapped at the barrel to prevent splitting. The last bundle was a rectangular tin box with a wire clasp. It contained savings certificates, envelopes of coins, a military medal, and a letter sealed with dark green wax. Elsie did not touch the letter. She arranged the certificates first by issuing bank and date. Most were small amounts purchased over many years: $25, $50, $100. Some bore Abel Wren's name. Others were made payable to a trust identified only as the Writing Room Fund. Their face value totaled exactly $34,000. The coins were held in 4 paper sleeves. She opened them one at a time and counted twice 11 Morgan silver dollars, 43, Barber half dollars, 62, Indian head cents, and 17 Liberty head nickels. Together they came to $32.97. At the bottom of the box lay 6 loose dimes, 4 pennies, and 2 cents fused green with age. The complete amount was $34,033.63. Elsie wrote the figure on the wall with a carpenter's pencil, then added the columns a 3rd time. The number remained unchanged. The medal lay beneath the certificates in a faded blue pouch. It was a Spanish War Service medal dated 1898, its ribbon nearly colorless. Around its edge, someone had scratched the initials HWC. She turned it over but found no other inscription. The sealed letter was addressed in brown ink, "To the one who opens the block." The handwriting tightened something in her chest. She had seen its careful downward strokes on labels in Abel's workroom, though this hand was older and less steady. She carried the letter toward the fire, then stopped. Outside evening had settled over the marsh. Elsie wrapped the certificates and coins, again returned the tools to their cloth, and placed the unopened letter inside her coat. She walked beyond the walnut trees to the edge of the water. Ice had begun breaking into dark plates, which shifted against one another with patient, deliberate sounds. A muskrat crossed the open channel and vanished beneath the reeds. Elsie remained there until the last reflection left the surface. The letter could wait for daylight. The room had kept what the world had forgotten. At sunrise, Elsie set the tin box beside the hearth and laid the sealed letter on the cutting table. The brown ink had faded at the edges, but the long downward stroke in the letter T was unmistakable. Abel Wren had written labels that way, pressing harder at the beginning of each word as though every name deserved a firm place on the page. Yet the hand before her was not quite his. It trembled at the turns and leaned farther right. Elsie warmed the wax between her palms, then lifted it without breaking the paper. My dear one, whoever you are. If you are reading this, the cutting block has opened and the room has accepted your patience. I hope you did not force the cedar. A thing made carefully should be opened carefully, even when it keeps what you need. My name is Wren Crowe. Dr. Samuel Whitcomb of Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston has told me that the weakness in my hands is caused by amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. He says there will come a day when I can no longer hold a knife, and perhaps another when I cannot speak clearly enough to teach. I am writing before that day arrives. Our trade began with Nathaniel Wren, born in 1781 in Sudbury, who cut quills for clerks and schoolmasters after the War of 1812. His daughter, Mercy Wren, born in 1818, moved the work to Concord in 1846, and taught her son Horace Wren, born here in 1852. Horace's daughter, Ruth Wren Crowe, my mother, was born in 1878 and kept this room through the first hard years of the new century. I was born in 1903 outside this cottage and learned at the same north window where you are likely sitting now. My husband, Henry Crowe, was killed in France during the Meuse-Argonne offensive on October 8, 1918. He had carried one of our quills in his breast pocket, though no one returned it to me. Our son Thomas was born after his death. He grew to repair old writing instruments and later taught a patient boy named Abel Wren, my cousin's grandson, everything I had been able to preserve. The trade closed on November 14, 1937. Since that date, this room has kept more than 35 years of silence. Before my hands fail, I must leave you the measures that matter. Cure fresh goose feathers in dry sand held between 140 and 150 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes, turning them twice. Soak a brittle barrel in warm water for 3 minutes, never more than 5. Cut the first angle at roughly 40 degrees, then narrow the shoulders by equal strokes. Open the slit only after the nib has cooled and sand it with 1 part pumice to 2 parts fine chalk until the edge no longer catches cotton. Do not mistake speed for skill. A quill is strong because the barrel has been respected, not because the knife was sharp. The certificates belong to the room. They were purchased from the small payments of clerks, teachers, and parents who could afford to give something back. The letters wrapped beneath them came from children who received quills without payment during winters when their families had no money for school materials. Read them when you are ready. Inheritance is not the keeping of objects. It is knowing how to put a blade down before it ruins the work, how to sharpen it when the fault is yours, and how to leave enough sound material for another hand. If you are of our family, forgive us for hiding too much. If you are not, then the work has chosen a family by another means. Behind the back door, beneath the third fieldstone from the left, you will find the marker my mother set when the first walnut tree was planted. Light the small brass lamp before you uncover it. That was her custom whenever a new apprentice entered. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Wren Crowe, Concord, Massachusetts, September 21, 1973. Elsie read the letter once without moving. Then she read it again, slower, resting her finger beneath the names. Thomas. The name appeared where her father should have been impossible. She folded the pages along their original creases, matching each worn edge exactly. Only then did she open the second paper packet beneath the certificates. Inside were letters written in many hands. A boy named Daniel thanked the room for a quill that had allowed him to complete an entrance examination in 1911. Rose Almeida wrote in 1924 that her sisters had shared one pen through an entire school winter. Another letter dated 1933 came from a mill worker's daughter who had learned enough bookkeeping to keep her family from losing their boarding house. Elsie closed the packet before reading more. She carried the brass lamp from the tool bundle to the back door. It was no taller than her hand, with a shallow oil cup and a narrow wick gone stiff from age. She cleaned the burner with a scrap of cotton, filled it with lamp oil, and waited until the wick darkened. The first match smoked out. The second produced a low flame with a blue root. Brass gathered the light and returned it softly against the wall. Outside frost covered the grass between the cottage and the well. Elsie knelt beside the back step and counted 3 fieldstones from the left. The third had been set flatter than the others. She loosened it with the draw knife and lifted it from the soil. Beneath lay a slate marker wrapped in rotted canvas. The words had been cut shallowly. Ruth Wren Crowe, planted here, April 1903. Let the work outlive the hand. Beyond the marker, one of the walnut trees moved in the morning wind. Elsie looked from its trunk to the cottage and understood that the photograph of lineage in the letter had not ended with Abel. It had narrowed through silence, loss, and careless keeping until it reached a girl sleeping on a bare floor with $4 hidden in her shoe. She returned the marker to the earth but left the inscription uncovered. That afternoon, small kindnesses arranged themselves around her without announcement. Margaret Bell had preserved $1 in a closed desk drawer. Silas Reed had brought well rope and left before being thanked. Owen Barrett had written credit beside her name and slipped an onion among the hardware. The librarian with the silver chain had traced a road for a wet stranger and asked no humiliating question. None of them had changed her life alone. Together they had carried it across a distance she could not have crossed by will alone. Before the story continues, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they had no reason to help. Perhaps it was a meal, a ride, a quiet word, or simply a door held open at the right time. Tell us what it was and whose hand offered it. Some gifts remain small only to the person who gives them. After dark, Elsie placed the 2 quill knives, the bone scraper, and the brass gauge beside her blanket. She set Eleanor's letter beneath the deed and kept the lamp burning until the oil reached the final line in its cup. For the first time, the tools did not feel like what had been taken from her. They felt like work waiting to begin. The first snow came on December 2nd and measured 6 inches against the north wall. Elsie read the roofing chapter in Owen Barrett's repair manual 3 times, once by the brass lamp, once beside the stove, and once standing beneath the sagging western slope with the book open in her numb hands. The roof measured 26 feet from eave to eave and 18 along the ridge. Allowing for waste, she calculated 9 bundles of cedar shingles, 2 rolls of felt, and 16 pounds of cut nails. Owen placed the materials on credit and brought out a roofing hatchet with a square pole and a worn leather grip. "My brother used this," he said. "He won't object." The next morning, Silas Reed arrived carrying a framing square. He had roofed barns before his back stiffened and refused every offer of payment. "You can repay me by listening." They sistered the split western rafter with a straight pine board, bolting it through soundwood before lifting the sag with a bottle jack. Elsie snapped chalk lines across the felt set, each shingle with the grain running downward, and learned Silas's 3-stroke method: start the nail seat, it then finish with 1 controlled blow. On the 4th day, he pointed with the hatchet. "That nail's proud." Elsie examined the raised head. "Pull it." She did. Wind delayed them twice and sleet drove them down once before noon. For 11 days they worked from first usable light until the shingles became too dark to align. By mid-December, the new roof lay straight across the cottage, its cedar pale against the old chimney. Snow gathered evenly on it that night instead of entering the room. January revealed damage the first cleaning had hidden. Several chimney bricks had spalled, leaving their faces soft and flaking. Mortar between the upper courses had powdered so completely that Elsie could brush it away with 2 fingers. She dismantled the worst section 1 brick at a time, numbering each piece in chalk before lowering it by rope. Owen showed her how to mix 3 parts washed sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, and 1/2 part fire clay for the joints nearest the flue. The mortar had to hold shape on the trowel without cracking at the edges. Elsie rejected her first batch, which ran too wet, and her second, which dried before she could bed a brick. The work took 3 weeks in temperatures that stayed between 22 and 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Gloves made the joints clumsy, so she worked barehanded and warmed her fingers beside a covered ember pot every 15 minutes. When sensation returned, it arrived as needles beneath the nails. She rebuilt the crown with a slight outward slope, tooled the joints with a rounded iron, and kept the new mortar shielded beneath damp burlap. Silas inspected it from the ladder without praise, which meant it would stand. On January 29, Elsie lit a test fire with newspaper kindling and 1 split log. Smoke gathered beneath the throat for a breath, then climbed. Outside, a gray column rose straight from the chimney and thinned over the marsh. The draw was clean. The white pine floorboards were wider than any modern plank Owen stocked, and each had been fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails. Elsie refused to pry them up merely because the surface had darkened beneath generations of soot, oil, and wet boots. She rented a random orbit sander for $14 a day. The first pass used 80 grit paper and removed the blackened finish without flattening the shallow tool marks. The second at 120 grit softened the scratches. The final pass at 220 left the boards smooth enough to take oil but not so polished that they lost their age. She worked around every rosehead nail by hand, sinking only those that threatened the sanding pad. The dust smelled resinous and faintly sweet. Beneath the dark surface, the pine emerged the color of warm bread. There was one morning when she began. The machine stopped it after less than a minute and walked to the marsh instead. A great blue heron stood in the shallows with 1 leg lifted, waiting so completely that the moving water seemed hurried beside it. Elsie watched until noon and did no work that day. The following morning, she swept twice, wiped the planks with clean cloth, and laid the first thin coat of boiled linseed oil. 2 more coats followed, each rubbed along the grain. She allowed the final surface 48 hours to cure without stepping across it. The boards deepened from dark honey toward mahogany, though the knots remained nearly black. When Elsie finally walked the length of the room in stocking feet, the floor gave no splinters and only its familiar 4th plank complained. Of the cottage's 8 windows, 3 had no glass, 4 were cracked, and 1 retained an original pane dated by its wavering surface and old putty to 1788. Elsie preserved that pane in place. For the others, she removed each sash, heated the brittle glazing with the brass lamp held at a careful distance, and lifted the old points without levering against the glass. She bedded replacement panes in DAP 33 glazing putty, pressing a thin, continuous ribbon into the rabbet before setting the glass. New points went in every 8 inches. The outer putty line was drawn with one steady pass of the knife, leaving its edge just below the sight line from inside. 4 sash cords had rotted through. She replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each length over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot where it entered the counterweight. The weights moved inside their pockets with a low iron sound. She repaired one window each day, allowing the putty to skin before closing the sash. The original 1788 pane received only a narrow repair at its lower corner. Through it, the walnut branches bent and lengthened strangely as if seen beneath shallow water. On the last window, Elsie finished the final putty bevel and lifted her head. A chickadee had landed on the nearest walnut branch. Its claws held the bark lightly while its black eyes followed the movement of her knife. It remained there until she lowered the sash into place. The plaster failed first beside the chimney. Behind the loose surface, the cottage still held hand-split oak lath, each strip uneven and darkened by heat. The old horsehair plaster had separated in 3 places where the bricks had once admitted damp. Elsie made 3 patches and all 3 failed. One sagged before sunset, another cracked around its edge. The third fell in the night and broke across the clean floor. Owen brought an old burlap bag from the rear of the hardware store. "My father kept horsehair for plaster," he said. "No one has asked for it in 20 years. Elsie washed the fibers, cut them to short lengths, and worked them into lime plaster until the mix held together when lifted. She pressed a scored scratch coat through the oak lath, leaving rough horizontal keys. Over it, she laid a 3/8-inch brown coat and allowed it 72 hours to cure beneath damp cloth. The finish coat went on 1/8-inch thick, drawn smooth with a steel trowel, and softened at the edges with a wet brush. When the final patch dried without moving, she rested her palm against it. "These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Bell, who owned the Mill Table Cafe, began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before sunrise. She was broad through the shoulders, wore red-framed spectacles, and tied each bag with white cotton string. Inside were heel loaves, hard-boiled eggs, or slices of apple pie wrapped in wax paper. Elsie caught her once halfway down the lane and tried to offer 2 coins. Doris closed Elsie's fingers over them. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." Then she walked away her shoes, leaving deep marks in the thawing mud. Caleb Reed arrived on a black Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, all elbows and knees, with a pale scar through one eyebrow. Without asking permission, he began breaking the storm-fallen walnut limbs into stove lengths and stacking them bark side up beneath the eave. Elsie carried out $1. Caleb shook his head and kept swinging. "My mother said, about your grandfather." He did not explain what his mother had said, and Elsie did not press him. By noon, the woodpile stood square enough to shed rain. Caleb drank from the well, wiped his mouth with his sleeve, and rode home with the maul across his shoulders. Reverend Boyd passed each morning on his way to a smaller congregation beyond the marsh. He was a thin man with silver hair, round spectacles, and a coat polished shiny at the elbows. He never entered. He merely paused at the gate, tipped his hat, and looked toward the roof chimney or newly glazed windows as though taking attendance. On the morning Elsie finished the plaster, he raised one hand. "Let honest work endure." Then he continued down the road. The prayer lasted 4 words, but it remained in the room longer than the sound of his steps. Elsie postponed the cellar until February 11. The stairs descended beneath the cutting room through a door swollen tight by winter. 7 granite steps led to a 12 by 15-foot floor of fieldstone packed with clay. The air smelled of wet mineral apples long gone and timber slowly returning to earth. At the center lay a dressed granite slab, unlike the rough stones around it. A mark had been carved into its face, a quill crossing a narrow knife above 3 short lines. Elsie cleaned the grooves with a dry brush, but did not try to lift the slab. Some questions deserve stronger light, better tools, and another season. Beneath the 3rd stair, her fingers touched oak. A small box had been wedged behind the riser and sealed with hardened wax. Inside rested a brass key. Its bow had been shaped like the curved shaft of a feather, with the nib forming the lower opening. Under the key lay a tintype wrapped in black cloth. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the cottage in summer. She wore a high-collared dress and held a quill knife against one palm. The walnut tree behind her was narrow enough to circle with both hands. Her face carried Elsie's brow, Elsie's straight mouth, and the same slight difference in height between the eyes. On the back, scratched through the dark coating, were the words, "Eleanor Wren Crowe, daughter of Thomas Crowe, age 25, summer of 1903. Elsie held the tintype beneath the cellar lamp until the woman's features seemed to shift in the uneven flame. She brought the key upstairs and placed it on the mantel beside the military medal. It fitted none of the door's cabinets, boxes, or locks she tested. There it remained. She did not know what it opened. By March, snow withdrew from the south wall in gray ridges. The creek beyond the marsh grew loud with meltwater, and green walnut catkins lengthened above the lane. Elsie sharpened the inherited knives, cleaned the brass gauge, and prepared fresh curing sand, yet she did not begin the full craft. The room had survived decades of silence. It did not need careless proof that she belonged there. She chose one worn coin from the loose change, spent it on goose feathers and pumice, and practiced only on short samples. Some barrels split, some nibs opened unevenly. She kept each failure in a shallow drawer labeled beginning. By April, she could cut a writing slit that held ink through 3 lines before softening. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Elsie completed the first quill she considered worthy of the cedar box. She had cured the goose feather at 145 degrees for 20 minutes, turning it once at 7 minutes and again at 14. The barrel cooled without warping. She cut the angle-shaped both shoulders in 6 measured strokes, opened the slit after the shell had gone cold, and polished the tip with pumice and chalk until it crossed cotton without catching. She filled it with black iron gall ink and wrote a single sentence on laid paper: "Let the work outlive the hand." The line remained even from first letter to last. Elsie placed the quill beneath the north window where morning light found it. The restored interior carried no appearance of newness. The floor remained marked around the rosehead nails. The original glass distorted the walnut branches. Feather drawers lined the back wall, each repaired but still bearing its faded labels. The brass lamp stood beside the cutting block, and the cedar roof beams held the dark scars left by the years of rain. In the front room, one narrow table was reserved for anyone who needed to write. The brass key stayed on the mantel until a February wind brought down part of the older walnut tree. Caleb, now taller and quieter, came to help cut the broken limb. Beneath a strip of loosened bark, he found a rectangular brass plate fixed directly into the trunk. Moss had hidden its edges, and the tree had grown around it until only a narrow keyhole remained. Elsie fetched the feather-shaped key. It entered without resistance. Behind the plate was a cavity lined with copper. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag wrapped in oilcloth and a narrow note written in the same hand as Eleanor's letter. The note was dated October 20, 1918, 12 days after Henry Crowe's death during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Eleanor had written that the flag belonged to the son her husband would never meet. She asked that it remain in the walnut tree until someone in the family understood that service and grief were not claims of ownership, they were debts of care. Beneath the note was a small envelope containing a lock of dark hair and one broken quill. Elsie carried everything inside but did not unfold the flag completely. She cleaned the copper lining, wrapped the bundle again, and stored it in the oak box beneath the third cellar step. The brass key returned to the mantel. The Spanish War Service Medal was honored on June 14, 2025 at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord. Elsie placed it beside the Crowe family marker on Flag Day, the anniversary chosen because Eleanor had hidden the folded flag for the child born after Henry's death. Reverend Boyd stood several paces away with his hat in both hands. No speeches were made. After 1 minute, Elsie returned the medal to its pouch and carried it home. The savings certificates remained untouched except for the interest required to keep the room weathertight and insured. Elsie used 4 old coins, one for the first feathers, one toward lamp glass, one to replace the split handle on the curing tray, and one to purchase paper for students who arrived without any. She placed the remaining coin certificates and letters inside a new tin box. Around it, she wrapped waxed cloth and wrote a label in careful brown ink for the next one. The box returned to the hollow cutting block. Elsie replaced the brass pin, turned the cedar disc until the grain disappeared, and tested the corner with her knuckles. The sound was close and solid. The shop reopened without a newspaper notice or painted banner. Doris allowed Elsie to pin one index card to the cafe corkboard. Quills cut and repaired, writing tools restored, no child charged for a first pen. Below it, Elsie wrote the road and the hours, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturday mornings. The first week brought 2 teachers, a clerk with an old family pen, and a girl who wished to write to a brother stationed overseas. Within a year, more than 40 names filled the mailing list kept in the front drawer. Some came for quills, others sent feathers wrapped in newspaper and asked only whether they could be saved. Elsie answered each letter by hand. Caleb returned one October afternoon carrying a long board beneath his arm. I had carved the words Crowe Quill Cutting Room into walnut, copying the worn proportions of the original sign. Beneath the name in smaller letters he had added, "and daughters." Elsie traced the fresh-cut letters with one finger. "There are no daughters," she said. "Not yet," Caleb answered. He raised the sign while she fixed the brackets beneath the eave. When it hung level, the final words caught the late sun and darkened against the wood. Doris brought candles in payment for the first bags of food. Margaret Bell came from the clerk's office and stood beside the gate, her copper birthmark bright in the cold. Owen Barrett inspected the brackets, tightened one screw, and said nothing. No photograph was taken. That winter, Elsie began a letter of her own. She used the first completed quill and wrote on paper thick enough to survive folding. She described the correct heat for curing feathers, the sound of a cedar disc turning free, and the importance of waiting before opening a slit. She recorded Doris's bread, Silas's well rope, Owen's ledger, Caleb's woodpile, Margaret's hidden dollar, and Reverend Boyd's foreword prayer. At the top she wrote, my dear one, whoever you are. She did not finish the letter in one sitting. Each year added a page. Each repaired window, sharpened blade, or child's first careful sentence gave her another fact worth preserving. When the pages became too numerous for one envelope, she tied them with green thread and placed them beside the certificates. The room had kept what the world had forgotten. Outside, walnut branches crossed over the lane. Inside, the brass lamp held one quiet flame while a young student leaned over the front table, learning not to press too hard. Elsie stood at the cutting bench and listened to the scratch of a new quill becoming steady. The feather quill cutting room waits. It has always waited. In the Middlesex clerk's office, the drawers were replaced during a renovation, but Margaret Bell kept the old center drawer beneath her desk. Inside it, flattened between two property cards, remained the dollar Elsie had paid on the morning the deed was stamped. Margaret never deposited it. She had written only one line across its paper band, for the person who came with 4.